So in this section, we're going to start talking about containers. Now, if you don't know, the container model for deployments is something that's been growing over the past few years and has taken over cloud computing in a big way. The real advantage to containers is that you create the container image on your desktop, on your development workstation, and that same image can be deployed unmodified into development, into staging, into production. It can go into Azure or AWS or Google Cloud Platform. You can push that image anywhere and it will run, right, within a container environment. And so containers are a cross-platform way of deploying code, whereas a web app can only run in Azure. You can't run a web app on your local environment, except for a private cloud environment. You can't run a web app into AWS or into Google Cloud Platform. You can't run a web app on your local machine, but you can run containers in all those places. So Azure has embraced the container model in a big way. So we have previously looked at web apps, and you can create a container web app, give it a name, put it in a resource group, deploy it into a service plan, and then you can push code in there as a container model, right? So it doesn't have, you notice there's no drop down to say what's the underlying, PHP, Python, Node.js, like there's no language choice because the container contains everything it needs to run. So you can choose whatever language you want because the container has to support it. So the web app container model is certainly one way to do it. You get all the benefits of web apps, including the ability to have scaling and auto scaling, the monitoring benefits and all that stuff. That's just one way to run containers. Maybe the most popular way and the most famous way is called Kubernetes. Now, Kubernetes is formerly a Google standard, but basically it's become one of the industry standards for running containers, but it does so in it's a cluster way. So you've got multiple underlying virtual machines and an orchestrator that has to control it all. So Kubernetes is a enterprise grade service that basically does have a lot of server resources required. So this is not cheap, nor is it the easiest way to run containers, but it is the industrial strength one. So if you're planning to have your code in containers and you want that to be a high availability and all of the tools that are provided to run this, Kubernetes services is the way. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Another way to run containers that we'll talk about in a future section of this course is called the container instance. Now, the container instance, Microsoft says, is the fastest and simplest way to run a container. And so this does not support scaling, and then you don't even have access to hardware. When you do a deployment of a container instance, you have to identify the image to run it from. And so really, this for me is demos, it's development, it's a quick look at something running in a container. This is not necessarily long-term production models. Container instances can be used for bursting. If you have a Kubernetes cluster and you need to grow, you need to add a node quickly, you can burst into a container instance because they are the fastest and simplest way. Adding a new node to your Kubernetes cluster, it takes a little bit longer time. It's like spinning up a new VM and then having to deploy all the code there, etc. I could also say that you could run a container in a virtual machine, of course, but then you would have to install your Docker or the container software onto that virtual machine, and you'd be responsible for that. Finally, there is a thing called Service Fabric, not going to be covered in this course, but Service Fabric does support containers. Now, this is more famous for their microservices model. It's a completely new way of running code, but you can run this as a containerized model. And so you have your cluster of servers. It's almost like an alternate to Kubernetes. It's a Microsoft proprietary alternate to Kubernetes. Service Fabric is cool because you can add servers outside of Azure into a cluster. So you can have 5 servers that are inside of Azure, 5 servers in AWS, and 3 servers in your own environment, and those are all managed by Service Fabric cluster. It's really cool, but it does support a containerized model. But again, this is not part of the exam. It's not part of this course. So in this section, we're going to start off talking about Kubernetes, and then later on, we're going to get into the Azure container instances for creating containers. So stay tuned.